The following is a recording of a real poker coaching session. To find out more about available coaching packages and courses, head to pokerfluency.com today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the video. I guess, first of all, let's catch up on what your poker activity's been like since the last time we did some coaching, because it's been a while. So how's your involvement been and how things been going in general?
All things considered, I'd say things have been going pretty well. I did message you a little thank you. I'd say that was my big moment I had last year at the World Series. Took 24th in one of the like $800 bracelet events, which was
I remember. Nice. Yeah.
wild ride, absolute dream. But just playing, I'm still in New York, playing up and down the DC, go to MGM National Harbor. I'll go to Philadelphia. I'm actually going to go to Philadelphia this week to play some tournaments and some cash games.
Cool.
But yeah, still just playing low stakes cash games, low stakes tournaments, and trying to get better. Played a little bit at Florida, went down earlier this year to the Hard Rock and played in a series down there. And yeah, just trying to get better.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. So let's, I guess, start diving into the assessment. How did you find the whole thing? Did you find it a test or a bit of a tough thing to verbalize some of it?
Yeah, some of it. I think I may have left a couple questions unanswered, just not necessarily knowing how to put to words how I'd like to answer. But it did feel a little testy, but it was also, I did like it also. I did find myself enjoy answering some of the questions. I remember Saturday morning, I was waiting to get my hair cut and was just like, hey, I can answer some more assessment questions. Let me get on my phone and look through and answer. So I liked it. I liked it a lot, actually. It's the first time I feel like we don't put our thoughts and things onto paper or have to rewrite them. And I think that's a helpful exercise.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised. The reason I asked how you found it is because I think a few people so far that have done it have had reactions to it where they're like, wow, I didn't realize how difficult it actually is to put my understanding of these concepts down on paper and to express these ideas in a way that forces me to organize them in language. Because I think that it reveals and highlights some things that maybe you feel like you understand them, but then when you try to explain them, you're like, actually, I don't really know if that is true or that's correct or things like that. So yeah, we can dive right in. Let me share my screen and I will start going through it.
And I did have that experience a couple times, which is fun.
Yeah, that's good. It's nice and it's healthy to have that. So that's all good. To start off with here, let's just go from the top, go from these big picture questions, and I'll tell you some thoughts about each one. And at the end, I've noted down a few areas that I think would be useful to look at or a good sort of structure for the 4 sessions that we have that come after this one.
Okay.
That should hopefully give us a good foundation of the things that we can cover that sort of might address some of these areas where maybe your understanding is a little bit weaker. So the starting point here, this question of where do you think your edge comes from? All of this is very reasonable, but the interesting thing is that none of this really actually categorizes how all of these things are causing EV to go from them to you, in the sense that they're all sort of areas where, yes, it's possible to be better than somebody else in that regard, but none of them are actually pinpointing, okay, I think my opponents are overfolding rivers. I think my opponents are making ICM errors. I think my opponents are doing this or this that is a mistake that I'm not doing, or I'm exploiting this mistake through doing this and so on, right? So for example, the way that I would answer a question like this is that I think the key thing that I've put a lot of time and energy into is understanding spots that are overfolded on rivers in particular. I don't put a ton of energy into trying to figure out complex exploits for the early streets. I just put a lot of my energy into making sure that I'm playing rivers better than my opponents or finding bluffs in spots where that people don't expect bluffs to exist, finding the bluffs in the under-bluffed lines and things like that, and being able to anticipate overfolds based on that. And I think that's one thing that is a big part of my edge. So that's one of the ways I would answer this question. But this is a bit more general, a bit more, these are all positive qualities that you think you have, but we're not specific to how they're actually, like how this exploitation is actually happening. And it's a common thing that people talk about exploitation, they talk about exploiting their opponents, but they don't really have a particularly clear idea in mind of how that exploitation is actually happening. So we'll flesh that out as we talk through some of these other questions. This second one here, yeah, this is certainly in tournaments. This is going to be very accurate, understanding aggression. Like just basically not being nits. Like if you're just not as nitty as everyone else is in tournaments, that's going to just immediately account for such a big portion of win rate. The names here, all of these guys are good guys to look up to. Obviously, they all play really well. Mateos in particular is somebody that I think is pretty much top 3 or 5 all time. Foxen probably too. I don't know Patrick here, but I'm sure there's good grinders up in the Northeast. I'm sure there's a lot of guys out there. So it's just good to have in mind what sort of players are the ones you're trying to model your game after a little bit. Going in more into the theory area here. Obviously, this EV answer here is very reasonable. Didn't really address the second part as much here. It's more just, we have to understand it because our goal in any sport is to maximize our EV. So it's a bit like someone who runs a business understanding profit margins. That's like why it's so important for us to understand it. But yeah, good definition overall, obviously. This second one here, the first part is very, well, okay. Both parts are reasonable, right? But neither of them actually capture the real benefit of position, which is that the player who's in position is going to be able to take polarized action much more easily. So it's going to be much more feasible for them to have a middle strength range of hands that checks, a strong range, or a polarized range that bets. And by doing that, they are going to, the EV of their range is likely to be higher. If you keep two ranges the same and flip the positions, being in position is going to have more EV, even if you don't change the ranges, simply because of the ability to make polarized decisions, because of the fact that they know that when they check, they immediately realize some equity by seeing the next street. So these two things, information is a partial benefit, but information only implies, how do I put it? There are plenty of situations where the fact that you act last gives you no information because your opponent checks their entire range, right? So information as far as what your opponent's range looks like or what type of hand they have or anything like that, sometimes that becomes part of the equation. But there's a lot of instances where we get no information based on the fact that we're in position because we expect a range check, right? And then controlling the size of the pot, I see where you're going with this in that it captures that idea of being able to check behind and realize another street of equity or just check behind to showdown on the river without paying an additional price. But I don't think pot control is a particularly useful strategic concept to think about because ultimately we don't control the size of the pot. Controlling the size of the pot is really, it makes sense to think about it in that way against weaker opponents. But if we check back the flop against a good opponent, sometimes they're just going to overbet the turn. And now like the whole idea of controlling the size of the pot isn't really relevant anymore because they just bet big and now the pot is just as big as it would have been anyway. So I get where you're coming from, but it's also, you don't really want to think about pot control very much because you just don't control it. So this raw equity and equity realization, all of this is pretty good. This pocket pair on a dynamic board, that sort of thing is a good example of equity realization being on the lower side. And then I think you're right about this last sentence. It gives us a better framework for making decisions. But the way I would describe the difference between these two things is that equity realization really encapsulates or allows us to measure the upside or downside of playing multiple streets of poker with a hand, right? So if we go to the flop, if our raw equity is higher than the amount of equity we expect to realize, then we would prefer to not play any more streets. We would prefer to check down to the river. If our equity realization is higher than our raw equity, or our realized equity is higher than our raw equity, then we like playing multiple streets. So it's essentially equity realization is it's about as good of a metric as we have of a way to mathematically categorize the benefit of actually having to play 3 streets of poker or 2 streets or 1 street or additional streets to some degree. That's how we could look at it there. All of this here about pot odds, very reasonable. Yeah, this is all very logical. The only thing I would probably say here, I guess the question's not particularly well phrased because I would have said calling and raising decisions, or I should have said calling and raising decisions, but basically just means that the smaller the bet that we're facing, the better price we're getting. So the more sort of reluctant we have to be to fold, basically. Pot odds are going to inform calling decisions by encouraging us to call more often or continue more often when we are getting a better price, basically. This one is interesting because I think this is a little bit off the mark as far as the definition of polarization. What I would probably say here is that, and this is a common thing, is that people often refer to polarization as an action that we take. But I think it's more productive to use that concept as simply it's polarized is an adjective that describes the nature of a range, or polarization is a property that we can ascribe to a range of hands, in that it contains strong hands and weak hands and doesn't contain anything in the middle. Polarization is not something that it's not something that we're saying. It's not an action that we're taking, because if we don't have a polarized range, let's say we check call twice, check call flop, check call turn, right? At that point, we don't have a polarized range. And so simply shoving all in on the river from out of position, like donk shoving or whatever, I can understand how we would look at that as that is conveying a certain level of polarization. But the reality is that we shouldn't convince ourselves that somehow now we do have strong hands and bluffs in our range, because the fact that we check call twice is a much more important factor, right? We can't suddenly have hands now that we couldn't previously have. So I prefer to use it as a descriptor of what a range looks like. And for the most part, the spots where this concept might be relevant to our decisions, it's almost always going to be anytime we're betting the river, shoving all in on the river, something like that, those concepts. And you're not wrong about what we're saying that we have, so to speak, but I would rather this be categorized in terms of an interpretation of our range, which is that our range contains strong hands and weak hands. And then this last sentence is, I'm struggling to really know what you mean with it, because a certain part of their range is nondescript. Like, we could bet one big blind and our opponent would fold the very bottom of their range, and this would still apply, but it wouldn't be a polarized decision. It wouldn't be coming from a polarized range. We don't need to polarize in order to get fold equity. And in fact, the primary reason why polarization is, to quote the question here, relevant to our decisions is because polarization helps us to understand how to maximize the amount of value that we get from the strong portion of our range, and ensure that our bluffs are approximately breaking even, right? Because that's the fundamental aspect of how our range, or how a polarized range, makes money, let's say on the river. The value hands profit and the bluffs break even. So this part here is, it's a little kind of wishy-washy, a little bit like not really particularly well defined. So I think at the end, with the list of topics, I think I did put like river construction and polarization on the list of things that would be probably pretty useful to look through, because I want to make sure this doesn't necessarily imply that you're definitely making mistakes in certain river spots, but it does imply that there might be some spots where you're not necessarily applying polarized strategies in the right context. We'll take a look at that. This one here this is another one it's not wrong at all. This is definitely true, but I think the thing that I was aiming at here really is simply that the reason why we can't take a hand versus hand mindset is just fundamentally because the game is a game of incomplete information, right? That we just don't have information about our opponent's hand. We don't know what the hand they have right now. And that's why the concept of ranges is so fundamental, right? It's why thinking in terms of ranges becomes so important, because that's the only way we can cater to that limited information that we have, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So none of this is wrong. Like I say, just want to go into a bit more detail there. This one here, describe the factors influencing optimal c-bet frequencies. Positions, board texture, certainly all of the things that you have mentioned here in terms of the flop and everything are relevant. Nut advantage here, definitely something that's relevant here. Though I would have liked to see maybe these kind of organized a little bit differently. Maybe just you're jumping around between concepts here, because it's true that the board texture affects things, but the reason the board texture affects things is because of concepts like nut advantage, right? That's the only reason the board texture matters. So you could reorganize them a little bit. And the other thing is that you didn't mention SPR at all here. And that's a huge one, right? SPR, stack sizes, that's, if anything, that might be the biggest determinant of what your overall c-bet strategy is going to look like. We certainly want to make sure we take that into account. Here, this is, the second part you got right here, like how do pot odds dictate the correct ratio. This is definitely true. What I would say, though, is that the first part here, the theoretical purpose of balancing, it relates to what I said about polarization, which is that our value bets profit and our bluffs break even, right? That's the theoretical purpose there. It's that even against a perfect opponent who understands approximately what our strategy looks like, it maximizes EV, basically. That's the idea there.
Okay.
This one here, obviously this connects to the pot odds question a little bit, and I saw you left it blank. I understand why, because it is maybe not a great question, but essentially it mostly, an appropriate answer here would be something along the lines of simply the smaller we're betting, the easier it is for us to value bet somewhat thinly, right? Because we don't have to win quite so often when we get called. Whereas if we are betting really large, the threshold of how strong our hand needs to be in order to value bet is going to go up and up, right? If we're shoving the river for 3 times the pot, it's very difficult to do that for thin value in most cases. So that's the general idea here. And this sort of connects a little bit to why I think it would be good to look at some river spots, because I think that just understanding that concept of the thresholds of value bets and how some of these ideas interact on rivers could be helpful. This is all very accurate. I think one thing that would probably be relevant is to also mention that not just that we also need to get more players to fold if we want to have a successful bluff, but that when we're evaluating things like equity advantage, nut advantage in multi-way pots, it's increasingly hard to have a nut advantage against multiple opponents, because we would need to have against one opponent, having more nut hands than them is not that difficult, but against 2 or 3 opponents, having more nut hands than the collective group of our opponents is just so much harder. So it basically comes down to, it's much more uncommon for any one player to have a specific range advantage or nut advantage in a multi-way pot. It's usually going to be the case that everybody has to jockey for position a little bit and kind of wait each other out a little bit, because there's not as much ability for one player to just be in the driver's seat on the flop. This one, again, not incorrect. I would probably want to flesh this out in a bit more detail, because in particular, the reason why it's a useful benchmark is because it tells us at what point we can profitably make an adjustment. So for example, if our opponent overfolds the river, we can profitably overbluff. And we need to at least somewhat grasp where the threshold is for that, because obviously we might be able to say our opponent is folding too much, but we have to understand where that line of too much actually is. So you're not wrong about this, but specifically the benchmarks and the actual strategies help us to know where those thresholds are, where we can actually profit from it. And this kind of illustrates to some degree sort of the same thing, is that you're not wrong that this is a deviation from GTO here, but it's also very debatable here as to whether this is clearly superior. And I think this is something that people really overlook. People tend to look at exploits mostly through this lens, where it's like, we have a specific hand and we want our opponent to do a specific thing, and therefore we're going to exploit by doing something that we're not usually supposed to do. I think that the problem with these kinds of deviations is that because solvers are not perfect at categorizing the various adaptations that our opponents might make across multiple streets, it's not always the case that betting for a large size on an earlier street just to get more money in the pot right now is going to be always the best play, because it's going to heavily depend on things like what the board texture is, what the range is that's going to call us, what the frequencies are that we're going to see turn and river calls in certain lines. And I think people do tend to default into like just trying to shovel a bunch of money in on the early streets against weaker players, thinking it's the best way to go, when in some cases, those weaker players very much know that's pretty much exactly what you're trying to do. And so when you do bet big on the flop and then you bet the turn, they just fold all their bluff catches and they're never actually going to continue other than with hands that are just drawing against your specific hand. So I guess the way that I would define it is that this can be superior, but I don't think it's an example where it's clearly superior. I think where it would clearly be superior is, let's say we get to the river, we believe our opponent is significantly overfolding. It is clearly superior to always bluff every single bluff candidate in that spot, right? That is inarguable, that if that belief that our opponent is overfolding is accurate, every single bluff candidate should bluff because they're all making money. So this is, I think, another thing. And it makes me aware of, I think, a general trend here, which is that like most of the ways that you're categorizing and thinking about things, a lot of your examples are coming from flops, basically, which is quite a common thing. And it indicates that you're probably thinking, in general, you're probably thinking too much about flops and not enough about turns and rivers, because most of the more sort of significant or more extreme examples of exploits and meaningful deviations and things like that, and examples of specific strategies, they mostly show up on rivers. So I think putting a lot more energy into turns and rivers is certainly going to be helpful. This one right here, yeah, this is very reasonable. Solver outputs are going to be very different from real humans, obviously, and tendencies across multiple straights as well. And we gave a turn example here. That's good. Never raising certain hands, whatever. This is a short explanation, but it's accurate. It's certainly accurate. I would probably want to point out that the computer simulation is done by it's essentially a calculator, right? We're just inputting a set of variables and we're telling it to run millions of iterations over and over again. Because I think when some people talk about solvers, they tend to think that the solver has some sort of internal logic that it's using that is provided by a human. But in fact, the solver's internal logic is just brute force math, right? It's just, all we do is we give it the options and it tells us which options are best. That's useful there. Okay, so now we'll move into some of the more strategic ones. Yep, this question about opening ranges, all very good. The question about 3-bet ranges here, I think the examples are maybe a little bit too specific here, in that there are a lot of different types of these ranges that exist. Your application of these concepts is broadly accurate, in that this range here that you've described here is to some extent a merged 3-bet range, but this range here is not a perfect example of a polarized 3-bet range, because first of all, there's only 2 bluffs in it compared to a bunch of value. But then the other part is that these bluffs are very high equity bluffs, right? And if anything, those high equity hands would probably be better served to be part of a merged 3-bet range, because these are hands that are good enough in terms of equity that they only partially count as bluffs, right? And what I mean by that is that in a merged 3-bet range, some of the hands in that 3-bet range will capture EV in more than one different way. So they will essentially be value bets and bluffs at the same time. In that, let's say if we 3-bet Jack 10 suited, we can get King Jack offsuit to fold, but we can also get called by 10-9 suited. And we have plenty of equity against pocket 6s, for example, right? If we 3-bet Ace 5 suited, we can get Ace 9 off to fold, we can get 6-5 suited to call, and we have plenty of equity against King Jack suited. 7-6 suited, similar sort of principles, right? We're flipping against some pairs, we're live against overcards, we're folding out better sometimes. So all of these hands, in fact, these hands are almost too strong to belong in a polar 3-bet range. And a polar 3-bet range is a lot more, you actually described it later on when you talked about big blind 3-bets. It's that it would include bluffs that are very clearly only capturing EV from getting a fold. They only benefit when they get a fold. So it's like, we 3-bet from the big blind, we have Ace 5 off, we have King 3 off, like we have all these hands that they're not capturing any EV from the times that we get called or we get 4-bet or whatever. They're explicitly only three betting for the purposes of making sure that we have bluffs in our range. And if we looked at that specific range, there's nothing in that three bet range that if we were to get four bet, or for example, four bet shoved on, there's nothing in that range that would have even a vaguely close decision, right? Or an annoying decision. So that's more a description of a polarized range. And then the other thing about a merged range here is that merged ranges are actually, they're applicable in a lot of spots, but a lot of it comes down to deep stacks where we want to have board coverage in our range. And this sort of last part of it, we don't want to play out of position or with multiple players. This isn't really part of it. I think it's always useful to remember that our strategy is never driven by anything that we don't want to do, because the solver doesn't want or not want anything. So the math regarding what our strategy looks like isn't based off of what we do or don't want. It's based off of what gains or loses us EV. And in this case, playing pots with multiple players, that doesn't inherently gain or lose us EV. We don't inherently lose EV by playing multi-way, because if it was to be the case that our opponents were playing optimally, then we would neither be gaining nor losing. And if they were playing suboptimally, we would be gaining, right? There's not somehow some way that we can play an optimal range and then still be losing just from inherently playing multi-way.
Gaining because there's more chips in the middle to win when we play multi-way?
Well, in this example, if our opponents were to, let's imagine our opponents were to just play incredibly passive. And this is a common thing. Like, we're in middle position, they're on the button, there's a guy on the button that just never folds, right? In that circumstance, we're gaining because that player is entering the pot with hands that are not profitable to enter the pot with, period. Like, they get to the flop without enough equity, right? So the amount of equity that we have relative to what we're supposed to have in a three-way pot is going to go up. Now, relative to heads up, our equity is going to go down. But the thing is that they've already put more money in the pot. So there's more money out there for us to win. So we could either, if you think about it as, we can either have 50% equity heads up or 33% equity three ways, those are the same thing. But if we could have 50% equity heads up or 40% equity three ways, because our opponent is too wide, we would actually benefit from having 40% equity three ways, right? So that's how you want to think about it, that we're not, if we're three betting a merged range, it's not because of something we're trying to avoid. It's because of the properties of that range and the opener's range to begin with. And in fact, a good rule of thumb is to just remember that the most important range to think about is always the range that has already voluntarily put money in the pot. Like, the opener is more important than any player, any individual player left to act behind us. Now, the number of players left to act behind us obviously matters because position matters, but any individual player, whether it's tendencies of players, whatever it is, our strategy is driven by the player who's already put money in there, as opposed to the uncapped ranges that are just 100% of hands that are left behind. So that's important. Another thing that I would say here, and I don't want to go too long because I don't want to waste too much time, but a polarized range isn't like inherently better or worse when we're attacking a wide range. And usually when we're attacking a certain portion of our opponent's range, it's not necessarily going to be the middle. It's going to be slightly below the middle. And the reason is that if you think about it in terms of pot odds, right? Let's say our opponent had a range of hands arbitrarily. They have the 100th percentile, they have the 0th percentile, and they have the 50th percentile. And imagine if their equity just mirrored that. The thing is that if the middle of their range had 50% equity, we would never be able to make those hands indifferent, because we can never give any hand worse than 1-to-1 pot odds. In fact, if you think about it in terms of, let's say, a pot size bet, quite often what will happen is that the portion of our opponent's range that we're actually making indifferent is going to be the stuff that has between 30 and 45-ish% equity. So a lot of the time, our pre-flop strategies are going to be driven around making the slightly below the middle portion of their range indifferent, more so than the actual middle, right? Because let's say like a pocket pair, if they open a pocket pair, probably can't make that indifferent, but we might be able to make, I don't know, ace 10 off indifferent against the three bet a lot of the time. Let's say something like that. This question about rake, all very good, all very reasonable. Question about the big blind defense here. This
was a tough question for me.
Yeah, and I think what it reveals here a little bit is there isn't really a logical process here, right? So the logical process here, what I was kind of expecting or hoping for here would be something like, okay, 100 big blinds deep, that means SPR going to the flop is going to be whatever. It's going to be like 15 or something. We're going to have to defend a bit tighter because of the high SPR. The open size is 2.5 instead of 2. So maybe that's going to make us a bit tighter as well. What 3-bet size am I going to use? I'm at 100 bigs. I'm probably going to use like 13 bigs or something like that here. If I'm going to use that size, then I'm going to have a pretty polar 3-bet range naturally. This is what my 3-bet for value range is going to look like. These are my bluffs. And then these are the hands that I think are good enough to call at a high frequency and all these things, right? So none of this is incorrect, but it's not really a systematic logical process. And it probably reveals a little bit that I would expect that your big blind defense is maybe a bit more reliant on memorization than on having an actual well-rounded process, which could cause some issues in spots where someone, let's say, opens a bit too large or is playing a bit differently to normal. So this right here, yeah, this is another one that's correct, but not for the exact right reason. All of this is true here. The suited Broadway hands are good squeezing hands, but it's not because they don't want to play multi-way. These hands are fine playing multi-way. They're still going to be profitable to play multi-way. The reason why they play so well here in squeezing spots is because the caller is usually very pocket pair heavy in a squeeze spot. And your suited Broadways are always flipping against all of their pocket pairs, but you also have blockers to all of the strongest hands in both ranges. And so you have the ability to 3-bet, and then sometimes you can get both players to fold a better hand. So you can 3-bet king jack suited and both players fold king queen off and ace jack off or something like that. So that's the main thing here. So you're not wrong. It's just the reasoning's a bit different. General idea here is as stacks get deeper, 200 plus, 3-bet ranges are just going to become more linear. They're going to become more geared around hands that can make very strong hands, as you identified, but specifically 3-bet ranges are going to become more linear. 4-bet ranges are going to become very polar in a lot of cases. Actually, no, 4-bet ranges are still going to have some linearity to them. It's 5-bet ranges that are going to become very polar when you're at like 200 plus. So essentially at 100, the 4-bet is probably going to be the last bet before the all in, but at 200, it's not really going to be a 5-bet shove. It's going to be like a 5-bet non-all in, which kind of has a knock-on effect on everything below it. So this is not a super important question, but that's just what the logic is. This is interesting because you're not wrong that board coverage is important, but in fact, it's actually a bit of a simpler answer than this, which is that simply there are different benefits there are conflicting factors that make it good to flat and good to 3-bet, in that when we 3-bet, let's say we have queen 9 suited, right? If we 3-bet, sometimes we can get better hands to fold, which is good, but we also get worse hands to fold, which is not ideal, right? We actually would benefit from those weaker hands, weaker queens or something, still being in our opponent's range. And then when we flat, we keep those weaker hands in, but we don't have that fold equity. So we also still have to play against those stronger hands. And then we also have the big blind behind us that sometimes they're going to squeeze and we're going to have to fold. But at the same time, sometimes they're going to call and they're going to actually have a worse queen or a worse 9 or something that we're dominating, right? So it's actually even simpler than this, which is simply just that there are pros and cons to both 3-betting and flatting. And the EV is simply not definitively good or bad one way or the other. The EVs are the same, basically. And that essentially is as far as we need to go here. If the EVs are the same in theory, that's pretty much why we might mix. So that's important there. This is good. Yeah. The other thing that I would say as well is that specifically a lot of them have the power to get better ace hands to fold. So they have the power to get like ace jack off to fold and stuff like that, which is really beneficial, but that's good. They're also unblocking various sort of king queen type hands that can just fold as well. This is very good as well. This is all very reasonable. Couple of skipped questions here. ISO raising, not super crucial. This one also not crucial, but basically just pre-flop sizing goes up when players are not 3-betting enough and goes down when they're 3-betting too much, but that's pretty
I would
reasonable
say
and fine.
the ISO one is maybe just a minute, because
Sure.
a lot of my games, especially the tournament games I'll play, there will be limps, especially early.
Yeah.
I would think what factors should determine whether you should ISO raise over limper. Yeah, it's another good. I kind of default to, for my sizing, usually I'll take 3x the blind plus any dead money just to disincentivize, or trying to, maybe not disincentivize, but just get a little more value, knowing that most of the time those guys aren't limping to then fold to a
Yeah,
raise.
I think you're absolutely right there. If anything, I think your sizing is just not big enough in those cases. Like, I think if, let's say there's 2 limpers and you just make it 5 big blinds, I don't think that's you should go twice that. You should go like 10, because ultimately, if you basically, what you want is, if your opponent is limping and they're going to have a range that's clearly suboptimal, you don't necessarily want to look at it as, I want to make them fold or I want to make them call. You want them to put as much money in the pot as possible while still having a range that is too wide for them to effectively play post flop. So you want to get right to that threshold where they're almost folding, but they don't quite fold. So if there's 2 limpers, maybe you go 8 from in position, something like that. If there's 3, maybe you go 10. But if you're out of position and they're going to be in position when they get to the flop, you definitely can go 10 from out of position. You want them to get to that point where they're on the threshold and they actually have a bit of a tough decision, but they probably still put the money in, because that's going to maximize your EV post flop to get them to still put a lot of money in, but not have a tight range. The more money you can get them to put in with that range, the better there.
Got it.
So that's the idea there. This is good. I think I would have liked to see maybe a bit of identification that specifically the hands that benefit from getting these folds are hands that don't play that post flop, less post flop play, the offsuit ace blocker type stuff. Those are going to be benefiting a lot here from these folds. This one we skipped here, but I would say, just as a general answer, it mostly just means our opponent cannot have the top of the deck. They can't have aces, kings, queens, etc. And it's usually going to mean that on later streets, there are certain board textures where they have very few strong hands. So you identified elsewhere, the ace, king, deuce type texture. The whole reason why those boards are the way they are is because our opponent is somewhat capped pre-flop. So that's what we're referring to there. This is good for sure. 10-9 suited, equity realization is better. Might have wanted to see a bit more detail, but that's fine. Tightening up your opening range and having less offsuit hands. Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. Just having hands that have more post-flop playability, looking for more domination for sure. The reasoning behind 3-betting bigger, out of position, all of this is good. The one thing I would probably want to say on top of this is that it's also about keeping our opponent indifferent between options. We don't want to give them too many easy calls, basically. So that's part of it. Then, this, flatting rather than 3-betting here, this is, that's all very reasonable. And then board coverage here is, you're getting the essence of it, but it's not specifically so that we're not predictable. It's mostly because if anything, it's in order that we can take advantage of, let's say, certain board textures that would usually be very good for our range. We want to make sure that we have bluffs on those boards, right? So it's not just that we want to be able to have strong hands on every board. It's actually that we also want to be able to have bluffs on every board. We want to be able to just have multiple options instead of having certain board textures where they absolutely smash our range. And even though our opponent is going to fold a lot, if we triple off, let's say, we don't ever have the opportunity to actually take advantage of that because we have no bluffs available to do it with, right? That's kind of part of it as well. This one, this is generally true. Ace, king, deuce is going to be better for our range than hands like 9, 8, 7 for sure. This one, range advantage and nut advantage. Yeah, mostly true. I would like to see more detail in just how these things influence these different factors. But you did do a good job here of coming up with an example of players, or one player having the range advantage and the other having the nut advantage. So that's good here. Position mattering so much for equity realization. This is actually covered in that earlier question, so I should take this out. But it's basically just all about having the opportunity to check behind when facing a check. Something like getting to the flop and being able to be in a situation where, a hand like bottom pair or a low pocket pair or something has the ability to just check behind against a fairly strong range and see the turn for free, as opposed to basically just having more options in terms of different strategies that can be viable. This one you left blank with the check raising range. Was this just unsure about what types of hands you're check raising?
To be perfectly honest, I think I probably looked at it, meant to come back to it, and then just forgot.
Yeah, no worries. That's fine. I mean, we don't want to say too much about that then. I think that's fine. This question about the second barrel with Queen Jack here, none of this is incorrect, but what's interesting is none of it addresses the fact that we have Queen Jack. So all of this is actually valid, basically any bluff that we could possibly have. So
yeah,
the element that we want to include is what are the properties of Queen Jack with one spade here that might make it favorable or unfavorable to actually bluff with. And in this case, it would be stuff like having a spade is good, blocking King, Queen, and King Jack is pretty good, having outs against the 7 is also good, unblocking diamonds is also good, unblocking a lot of 7x is good. There's just like a lot of good things about this specific hand that might make it a very reasonable barrel here, but we only focused on what
the
we're
flop
doing.
Yeah,
we're like, I see where you're going here, and that we can get some folds from like the diamonds, and absolutely true, but doesn't really address Queen Jack specifically. So this is covered in an earlier one, so I should refine this a little bit. For the most part, betting less often for value, or specifically betting a little bit thinner for value and betting a bit more. We're also a bit more suit dependent as well, which is something we can talk about, but our value bets are going to come a little bit more from specific combos of hands. So having the ace of diamonds on a 2-diamond flop or something like that, we're going to be more specific to that multi-way compared to heads up. And there's some other factors like that, but generally here, this is good. The main thing here with this next one about under bluffing opponents, really the most important part of this would just be that we just don't bluff catch. If they're under bluffing, we should not bluff catch anything. So if it's not just facing a larger size bet from our opponent, it's facing anything. We basically should only call when we beat value if they're under bluffing. And it's also, I think you're right in the sense that like this first part is correct because I can see where you're getting at, but I think it's specifically, I think what you're referring to is that we can value bet a bit thinner. We can value bet hands that sometimes might be a bit scared to value bet because they're indifferent against the check raise, when if we know the check raise is never a bluff, we can now just value bet and fold. So I think that's what you're getting at. But yeah, we want to flesh that out a bit more. Yeah, the river being the street where ranges become the most polarized. This is actually a fairly simple one. So this might have been just one that you plan to come back to. But it just comes down to there are no more cards to come and there are no draws left in the deck. So a big chunk of hands are going to have close to 100% equity or close to 0% equity in a lot of cases. So that is part of why that's the case. All of this is good here. These are good questions to be asking, but what I would recommend here is putting this part, like the value range, at the beginning. Like the first thing you want to think about is what is the value range? What is the range of hands that can take this line or use this size for value? And where a lot of people go wrong is they start to think about the bluffs before they've really considered what the value range is that they're actually facing. Because sometimes it's true that your opponent's not going to find a lot of bluffs, but they also have very little value as well. And the spots where bluff catching actually is good a lot of the time are going to be situations where your opponent is supposed to go pretty thinly for value, but they're not doing it. So that's important and useful, I think. This is not inaccurate. I would have probably been more likely to say we would rather just have the ace of hearts, because having the 8 of hearts and specifically blocking the straight flush isn't that useful compared to blocking all of the nut flush combos. But I see the principle here for sure. We left out this one. This, again,
I couldn't figure out a way to really put it to words.
So I think that it touches on, I think that it would be useful to look at some river stuff, because it really comes back to what we said at the beginning about it allows your value hands to get max value and your bluffs break even and get max fold equity. And when your range is polarized, an overbet or an all-in shove is going to maximize your EV. So just theory-wise, that's why that comes in. How does the size of your river bet influence the number of bluffs? Bigger we bluff, the more often it works need to be profitable. this is it's so interesting because this comes up. Almost everybody that's done one of these assessments has mixed up the concept of pot odds with the concept of minimum defense frequency. And that's what you're doing here, which is that how often it needs to work to be profitable. That's a range level question, right? It's a question for how often is our opponent folding like their overall range, right? But the pot odds, the number of bluffs that we can have, the equity that the price that we're offering our opponent, that's a hand level question because we're offering them a certain level of pot odds, and each individual hand within their range has to have that much equity or more in order to call. So we're mixing up two different types of concepts here. And you are correct that, or you mentioned it earlier, that the bigger we bluff, the worse pot odds we're giving them, therefore the more bluffs we can have. And you're also correct that the bigger we bluff, the more often it needs to work to be profitable. But this question about the size of the bet and pot odds, or the number of bluffs we can include, it's a pot odds question. It's not an MDF question. It's not a defense question. This next one, yeah, this is good, except I would say the only thing here is that we probably wouldn't really have much incentive to be taking vulnerable, like medium strength hands and betting those. We would just be betting the bluffs, like the bottom of range that is very weak. The medium strength hands, like they still would have an incentive to check.
Yep.
Then we go into the chip EV stuff. Okay. Yep. That's all very reasonable. Big blind ante. Yep. All good. No rake. Also good. Yeah. Big blind ante is a big factor here, right? It's that there's a lot more calling of pre-flop ranges in tournaments. And when that's the case, the big blind is getting such a good price that there's going to be a lot more multi-way. This one's good as well. Skill edge not being super important. That's good. I like that. This is also accurate. We identified early on what polarized ranges look like. So you're absolutely right that we do generally want to have a polarized 3-bet strategy from the big blind. This is also correct. So a lot of these concepts about tournaments and some of the pre-flop considerations and stuff like that, also very relevant. This is also very good as well. So a lot of good answers here. Only thing that I would say is that, again, it's not always about the middling portion of their range. The only time we can actually take the middle of their range and make it indifferent is if we have a really big nut advantage. And this is actually one of the spots where that is true. So to some extent, there will be spots where we can use this massive nut advantage that we have to just make a 5 immediately indifferent. Like we can just put them in a spot where we just bet massive, and when they have a 5, they're just immediately indifferent. So that can happen. It's just usually we're not targeting that high up because we usually don't have that big of a nut advantage like we do here. This one is true, but we want to identify why it's true. And the reason is because as the SPR goes down, the amount of equity that we need to have in order to profitably stack off also goes down. So if the SPR is 1, we only need to have 33% equity to profitably stack off with no fold equity. So you're not wrong about this definition, but you haven't quite nailed the specifics of why this is true, right? Like why we're more comfortable stacking off with top pair when SPR is shallower. Does that make sense?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. You want to look at it also as far as if you were to look at a deep stack cash game, like we clearly, when we're risking being all in would mean risking 10x the pot or something. Clearly the amount of equity we need to have in order to get it in profitably there would be much higher, right? It'd be close to 50%. So a couple of missed ones, but that's fine. These are not like massively, these might have been ones that you just plan to come back to. This one is interesting because we do see bet less often, but a lot of people don't. Oh, sorry, we see bet more often as stack sizes decrease. I thought the question said increase, but yeah, we see bet more often as we get shallower, and most people tend to think it's the other way around. But it's all because of being able to stack off wider when we're shallower. This reasonable, yeah, for sure. The Jack 7 Deuce one is interesting because you're right that the under the gun has the advantage. However, under the gun does not have all sets here. Under the gun does not have deuces at 40 big blinds.
I was thinking about that.
Have deuces. Yeah, they definitely should not have deuces. 40 big blinds is going to be like from under the gun. It depends if you're 8 or 9 handed, but let's say we're under the gun 8. it's going to be like fives plus, basically. So they don't have deuces. And on top of that, the button absolutely has ace jack offsuit as well. They also probably have at least some king jack offsuit. More of the under the gun range, strong ace x, king x, queen x. Yeah, but the thing about this like region of hands, if we're talking about just high card hands, is they are not really going to influence the actual strategies very much. It's all going to be about the hands at the top of the range. So you're right. Like everything that you say here in terms of under the gun having the advantage is correct, but it has a lot more to do with the overpairs than it does anything else. So that's the thing here. It's that under the gun can have jacks or sevens. The button can have a little bit of jacks, but definitely all of sevens and deuces. But the main sort of region of hands that under the gun can have that the button pretty much can never have is aces, kings, and queens. And that's 18 combos of overpairs, all of which are very strong on this board and can certainly put a bunch of money in. So the top pairs and everything, none of that really matters that much because both players actually have a pretty decent chunk of them. So that's the main thing here. This is good. Yep, certainly reasonable spots to donk bet those low card boards. I see what you're getting at here, but playing a less volatile strategy is definitely not the major aspect of ICM. What it means is that it's changing the thresholds of how much equity we need to take on certain levels of risk. So volatility is inherent. Like we don't really get to control the level of volatility we take on. There are some spots where we can choose certain things differently to actually lower volatility, but most of the time that's going to be post flop where maybe we take a strategy where there's no raises on a certain board or something like that. This one here, generally ICM is going to make bets and raise sizes smaller, and it doesn't change a ton based on a player's stack size. It's quite common for people to think that when you're the big stack, you just get to shovel in a lot more big bets, but that's not always true because sometimes you're up against a tighter range. So that's another part of it. This one, yeah, we would want to look at risk premiums. We would want to think about big stacks not having as much risk premium. This is very accurate, but again, we would want to reference risk premiums here. This concept here is also good, although I would also want to highlight that just because we are covering them by a lot doesn't mean that we have no risk premium at all. We do sometimes have some risk premium. This is all meaningful this is all good except for this part, which is that you're going to sometimes bust when you're not the shortest stack. Like it's going to happen. It's not guaranteed to be a mistake at all. There are plenty of spots where you just have to get it in, even though there's a shorter stack. And what this is speaking to is people tend to take ICM too much in a binary way. It's like, I'm either laddering up or I don't care about laddering up at all. And in fact, it's a sliding scale. It's a model that changes the value of our decisions. So risk premium, what it really is here, you're right. It's that how much more equity we need to have in regards to facing a bet. But again, this is also losing chips is horrible. That's not true, right? Like losing chips is just, it is what it is. It's just that risk carries with it. Risk carries a premium, right? We are always going to sometimes take risk and sometimes lose chips, but the relationship between the upside and the downside is going to change when there's ICM in play. So we're always going to have to take on risk. And we don't want to get into a mindset of anytime I lose chips in an ICM spot, it means I made a mistake. But we do want to understand where that premium is and how big it is. So we'll see at the end, I added ICM to the list of stuff that I want to take a bit more of a deeper look at. This one, yep, this is good. More hands applying pressure for sure. This one is not really accurate here. Like you can certainly shove suited broadways from under the gun in an ICM spot. There's nothing wrong with that. And again, not all ICM spots are equal. There are some ICM spots where, depending on stack sizes, whatever it is, shoving certain hands can be fine. Some where it's not. Some where you're going to take a pure min raise and you're not going to shove anything. And the other thing is that tournament life is not a thing, so to speak, right? In that your tournament life, quote unquote, is valued at whatever the value of your stack is. And that last chip in your stack, people say, oh, the last chip in your stack is the most valuable one. And that's true. But if the difference is between having one big blind and having 0 big blinds, then the only difference there is whatever the value of one big blind in ICM is. That's the thing that we don't want to convince ourselves that we should just never stack off. And we also don't want to convince ourselves that covering somebody by one big blind is inherently a big deal, because it isn't. Covering them by 2x their stack, that's a big deal. But if we have one big blind more than them, then they can still hurt us a lot. And people tend to overestimate that too. They tend to look at, oh, I cover him. And it's like you cover them by 3 bigs, to where if you stack off to him, now you're basically out of the tournament. And that's a big deal. Okay, so heads up, I certainly put on the list because we absolutely have to look at some heads up stuff. The reason why ICM is not a thing is simply because there is no third player who can benefit from the exchange of chips between the two players. Like every chip you win is the same value as a chip that you lose. This here, again, it's a costly mistake to bust with 2 shorties present. Again, not necessarily true, right? There's a range of hands that they have to get in with 2 short stacks. Like there are going to be crappy spots that come up where there's 2 short stacks and you have the chip leader shoves on you and you have like jacks or something, but they're just shoving so wide that you just can't fold. And there's going to be spots like that. See, this is interesting here because in fact, what I was getting at here about the differences between bubble ICM and final table ICM is that at the bubble, ICM pressure is mostly placed on the short stacks, but at the final table, it's mostly placed on the middle stacks. So it's not about how tight we can play. It's about which players incur the most ICM pressure. And that's a product of various things, but it basically is a product of the short stacks. When you're a short stack on the bubble, the majority of the EV that you do have, or the majority of the value of your stack, comes from your opportunity to cash the tournament, because the model accepts that you're probably very unlikely to win if you're a short stack and you're around the bubble. But when you're at the final table, a short stack in comparison actually has more incentive to gain chips, because when you gain chips at the final table, you're directly taking them away from somebody else and you're turning somebody else into a short stack. And so basically because the pay jumps are biggest and things like that, it's the middle stacks that are most pressured at final tables. This is another one where you're right that we're incentivized to play tighter, but not incentivized to play almost any hand is an overstatement, because it massively depends on what the other stacks are, right? If we're second in chips, but there is no significant short stack, our risk premium is going to be very different compared to when we're second in chips and there's a 1 big blind stack at the table. I would definitely want to make sure that we incorporate that to some degree. And this is why I put ICM on the list of stuff to look at, because I think we have to try to get out of that binary approach to it. This kind of approach here, all of this is very reasonable, very logical here. And it seems reasonable. And so just finally, heads up, we certainly do play a lot wider. With a big blind ante, we basically don't fold the button unless we get like below 10 bigs. For the most part, we definitely want to do some heads up work because it is important. And obviously a big chunk of your EV in tournaments is going to come from winning heads up matches. So the 4 things that I put in that I wanted to cover in the sessions that we have left is firstly, just evaluating flops and choosing flop sizes, which I think for the most part, a lot of your stuff in here was good, except for with the Jack 7 deuce example, a couple of things in there, maybe just focusing a little bit off the mark on certain things. And I want to make sure that we're looking at some of these spots in the right way. Then we've got turn and river construction, and particularly polarization, looking at some polarized river spots, how we're building river strategies and picking sizes. Then also going through some ICM stuff, looking at risk premiums. I'm going to actually note that down there, and just exploring how risk premiums work. And then finally, just some fundamentals, a crash course in like heads up at like 10 through 40 big blinds. Because if you understand big blind ante heads up at those sorts of stack depths, and you just have a broad knowledge of approximately how the strategies look, that's going to be a much better starting point than just having no knowledge at all, because it's so easy to make huge errors heads up. And even just against recreational players, we obviously want to make sure we don't do that. So this would be, I think, the structure I'd want to go with. I know we went over time a bit today, but don't sweat that. It's fine. So this would be, I think, what we'll do for the remaining 4 sessions. And
Sounds good.
I think we got a pretty good picture of some of the stuff that's most important. And there's a lot of detail we can go into, a lot of different types of situations that we can look at to flesh out some of these concepts and shore up some of your understanding.
Great. Sounds good to me. Thanks,
Cool.
man.
All right. No worries.